Let me introduce Dana Robert. Dana is William Fairfield Warren Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission at the School of Theology at Boston University. And her paper this afternoon is Migrant Methodism, the Pastors of Harbin, Manchuria, and Memories of the Russian Methodist Movement.
The history of Russian Methodists of Harbin, Manchuria is the story of a diaspora people. Harbin was a Russian outpost built by workers of the Chinese Eastern Railway. And during the 1920s, hundreds of thousands fled the Bolsheviks and crowded into Harbin, making it the largest Russian city outside the Soviet Union. This doomed community was caught between the rising might of the Soviet Union, Chinese nationalists seeking control of Harbin, and then after 1932, the Japanese military regime that conquered Manchuria. Shifting political alliances forced many to become Soviet citizens, and they were repatriated often and liquidated in the Soviet Union. As former political white Russians, Harbinites endured a lifetime of exile and immigrated to port cities in China, Australia, Canada, the United States, or anywhere that could take them. Very similar to the way the middle class is trying to exit Russia today. By 1985, only 37 elderly Russians and a collection of graves remained of this vibrant community that had numbered thousands. Now, while living in Harbin and other small communities along the railway, some of these refugees found new life in Christ and a new identity as Methodists. Before the Bolsheviks conquered the Russian Far East, missionaries from the South Georgia Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South were ministering first to Koreans and then Russians here in Vladivostok. So we see Vladivostok on the coast, and then the Bolsheviks conquered Vladivostok, looted the city within 3 days, and then missionaries and their first converts went along the railroad here to Harbin. So we have a group of missionaries then who went along with some of their early converts. Now here is the group, some of the missionaries about whom I'm speaking. This is George and Veda Urban, and here you see their arrival at the Harbin train station. By 1927, so in simply 4 to 5 years, the Russian section alone of this Siberia-Manchuria mission boasted 6 churches, elementary and high schools, a business institute, a medical clinic, community social center run by women, orphans ministry, and a 3-year theological school. There were 73 persons on the payroll, including 5 doctors and 2 nurses, dentists, teachers, and native pastors and evangelists. So this was a comprehensive mission. The Southern Methodist missionaries worked among a polyglot refugee population alongside other Protestants, including Baptists and Lutherans and the YMCA. So here you see the first issue of the Christian Advocate that the missionaries began publishing in 1923 as soon as they went to Harbin. By 1927, Bishop Ainsworth closed the mission, ostensibly for lack of funds. The missionaries and local Methodists were devastated. Missionary George Irwin recalled that when his train pulled out from the station, dozens of traumatized Russians stood on the platform until his train passed from sight, and it was the worst day of his life. So the closing of a Methodist lifeline was part of a tragedy that unfolded for the Russians in Harbin during the 1920s and 30s. They were a refugee people seeking to get into any country that would let them in. But interestingly, the closing of the mission did not mark the end of Russian Methodism. Several of the local pastors held on without outside funding. they kept open their small self-supporting Methodist churches through the 1930s until forced to close by the Japanese. Methodist preachers and evangelists continued itinerant mission work as part of the larger evangelical Protestant diaspora movement in East Asia in the 1940s. Former missionaries and the Methodist Committee on Relief continued helping Russian Methodists escape from Manchuria all the way into the 1960s. Because they were migrants, most of the thousands of Harbin refugees moved on. Many did not remain connected with Methodism. But some of the pastors immigrated to the United States and retained their connections, both with former parishioners and with American Methodists. Others became Pentecostals or moved into other evangelical denominations or pastored non-denominational Russian-speaking churches in exile. The last Harbin Methodist pastors prayed for the revival of Russian Methodism until their deaths in the 1980s and early 1990s. And one of them, Gregory Yasenitsky, lived just long enough to hear about the first stirrings of the new Russian Methodist Church for which he had prayed for his entire life. So here I have a picture from the Methodist Advocate of the very first preachers and missionaries with the bishops. And you can see that you have Bishop in the middle, the two missionaries, Irwin and Jenkins, next to him. And here is Poisty, who I'm going to talk about a lot because he was a Methodist missionary, in fact, from Finland, who had come to Harbin. And then here we have the two first converts, two of the first preachers. Now, my search for Russian Methodism was a gift of the Holy Spirit disguised as a love for classic Russian literature. And my intersection with this material begins in the fall of 1974, when I enrolled as a freshman in a Russian class at Louisiana State University. Next to me in the chairs was a fellow United Methodist, John Irwin from North Louisiana, and it turns out he was in there because his grandfather here had been the main missionary in Harbin. So as my calling to become a church historian deepened, by 1978, I went with John and his brother to visit George and Veda Irwin, who were then elderly living in the mountains in Hiawassee, Georgia. And George Irwin was starting to descend into Alzheimer's. By the time we got there, the Irwins had just burned all their papers, but they were able to talk to me about what they experienced and how they had assisted desperate Russians trying to flee. Veda Irwin was the last missionary out of Harbin. On her way back to Georgia with her 3 children, she wore a money belt with the mission's liquid assets and turned over the money to mission headquarters in Seoul, Korea, and dropped off half a dozen Russians, refugees, to their new homes along the way. So that then started for me many years of corresponding with the children of missionaries, of trying to track down anyone I could find who had been connected with these Protestant and especially Methodist missions in Harbin in the 1920s and 30s. And just to give an idea of what I found, one woman I met in Russia in 1985 told me that her family was attracted to the Methodist choirs, but that they felt the Methodists were too familiar with God. Another correspondent, the famous poet Valery Pereleshin, wrote to me from Brazil to tell me that even though he liked them personally, he considered Methodists to be sectarians. On a trip to Geneva, I interviewed the artist Irina Brenner, cousin of actor Yul Brenner, who told me how he and the other members of her family escaped from Vladivostok and Harbin. And on and on. I found remnants of contacts with elderly emigres and heard desperate tales of migration and of what they thought of the Methodists and then how they escaped from Harbin. Unfortunately, it was probably about 10 years too late to launch a much needed oral history project. Now, through the Irwin family, I made my most important contact, the Reverend Gregory Yasinitsky, who was the person in the top right of this newspaper article. And he was one of the first two deacons ordained by Bishop Hiram Boaz. Over several years, he answered my questions through correspondence, and then I was able to visit him in San Francisco, and I show the picture here of the hymnal that he and others created in Harbin that Yasinitsky smuggled through the Japanese lines when he finally escaped from Harbin in the 1930s. Now, the reason I want to show this hymnal is because I had what seemed to be the only copy at the time. After the revival of Russian Methodism in the 1990s, I gave a copy of this hymnal to hymnologist S.T. Kimbrough, who took it to Bob Harmon in New York, who hand carried it back to the Hymnal Committee of Methodists, then meeting in Russia. They didn't know they had a hymnal. And anyway, there's a lot I could say about why this story of retrieving this material is so important. Now, I also rely in this talk on selections from the Russian language journal Methodist that the missionaries started in 1925 to replace the more generic Methodist Christian Advocate. And here, just to show you the kind of material you can get from this, here is a picture of the Epworth League in Harbin in 1925. And notice it includes Chinese, probably Koreans. This was a polyglot multi-mission that met in 3 different sections, Korean, Chinese, and Russian. And of course, I'm focusing on the Russian, but the journal contains lots of information on the Chinese and the Korean churches, as well as Russian language evangelists. Sorry. Now, from the missionary perspective, the central goal of the mission to Russians was to, quote, awaken men's souls and bring them to the Lord Jesus Christ. So, of course, the mission focused on planting churches and training a, quote, native pastorate, as well as substantial outreach among refugees. In 1923, the mission opened the Biblical Institute with its 3-year training program. 9 male seminarians and 5 female auditors enrolled for courses in Old and New Testament, church history, systematic theology, homiletics, Methodist polity and history, English and Russian literature. They held classes 5 days a week for 11 months a year, and then 1 month in the summer was dedicated to revival meetings. This was a practice typical of Southern Methodists in the 1920s. The students in this institute simultaneously were students and carried a full pastoral load, founding and pastoring churches, doing Bible teaching, directing their big choir, with music ministry, preaching, pastoral care, and so on and so forth. Now, here I have a photograph in 1925, of the missionaries and pastors at the time. So here I will talk about some of them. You see on the front row are the main missionaries. Here's the bishop, here is Irwin, and here's Jenkins and Poisty, the Finn, who were the actual missionaries. And here you have Gurov and Yasinitsky, who were the first two ordinands. And I'll say more in a minute about the different men on the back row. But let me say a word about Nicholas Poisty right here, because this, looking at his life shows the complexity of looking at Methodism as a migrant movement and how it intersected in and out with other branches of Protestantism. Nikolai Poisty was born in St. Petersburg of mixed Russian and Finnish parentage and became a Methodist in Russia. and he wrote many articles in the various journals that this mission produced. Now, despite his extensive work as Methodist theologian, he wrote theological works, and as pastor and head of Methodist, a lot of ministries in St. Petersburg, then in Harbin, in the Protestant historiography, Poisty has been remembered as a pioneer Pentecostal in Finland. So after Harbin collapsed and he eventually goes back to Finland, he becomes a Pentecostal. And you see the in and outs of Methodism with the other evangelical churches at this time. So that Poisty's very identity and the fact that he's held up today as the great Pentecostal pioneer in Finland tells us what kind of historical research we need to be doing and how we need to be reframing our view of what Methodism was and did in a migrant situation. This picture, I already explained who's on the front row, but let's look at who's on the back row. Now, to the best of my ability, I've identified these on the back row. K.D. Igorov, about whom I'll talk more. A.F. Gavrilovchuk, a Ukrainian, about who I'll speak more. Bradovich, Osipoff, Pyatakov, Vologov, and Shibanov. So by 1927, all these men were pastoring in the 6 various churches, despite terrible persecution from Bolsheviks, from the Orthodox, from Chinese. But the worship in the combined churches was at least 800 people, with over 1,000 persons attending the 2-week revivals that they held. Many, many more hundreds took advantage of the Methodist social and educational services, including their very famous choir that had 8 opera singers in it. So you get a picture of a lot of musicians gravitated toward the Methodist movement. Now here, this man, Gavrilovchuk, was a Ukrainian. He and his wife, Panya, met the Irwins in Vladivostok and followed them to Harbin. So this was the first convert and the first so-called native preacher of the Russian mission. He was received into membership in Vladivostok December 17th, 1922, with several others. He became associate pastor of the Central Methodist Church in Harbin, serving under George Irwin, who served as the senior pastor. Gavrilovchuk conducted visitation, preached, led prayer meetings, taught Sunday school, was president of the Epworth League, and it was an interpreter. And I don't have time to read it right now, but he had a very profound testimony that I'll have in the written version of this paper, where he talks about God speaking to him through the Methodists, God calling him to preach to his own people, God saving him through the Methodist Church, and that he felt was very honored to be the first Methodist in Siberia. Now, when Mrs. Irwin closed down the mission, she took the Gavrilovchuks with her and enrolled the wife at Young Harris College, a small Georgia Methodist institution from which she and her husband had graduated. And Alex here was enrolled at Emory College, at that time a small Methodist institution. According to what I found from correspondence with other missionary kids, 2 years later, the Gavrilovchuks returned to Harbin, where they continued their church work, and ultimately fled to Shanghai. Because he remained free during World War II, he assisted the Methodist missionaries who were interned in the Japanese POW camp in the area around Shanghai. Eventually, the Gavrilovchuks were able to get away from China and settled in Canada and affiliated with the Lutherans. So again, what is a Methodist? He spent 30 years as a Methodist, but ends up, probably because of Lutheran World Federation or something, ended up in Canada as a Lutheran. Now I'll speak here about Gregory Yasenitsky, who was the first convert and ordinand of the mission in Harbin. He was the linchpin in the recruitment of other pastors. He had been raised as a Moravian or Stundist, and he had thus already extensive knowledge of the Bible and Protestant hymnody. A former officer in the White Army, he was instrumental in recruiting other military officers for church leadership. He and his wife were both talented musicians and composers. He was born near Kiev and was of mixed Polish, Russian, and German ancestry, but was raised in Irkutsk, where his father worked on the railway. So you see, these folks were often, a lot of these guys were white Russian army officers, and Methodism appealed to them. They were also transnational. Some of them worked on the railroad. So you can see some themes in who became the leadership group among the Russian Methodists. Now, Yasenitsky has a harrowing personal story that I don't have time to recite now, of barely escaping from massacre of his entire regiment by the Bolsheviks. So when he started with the Methodists, he entered the first class of the Biblical Institute and was ordained by Bishop Boaz. Ultimately, he served in 3 churches and administered educational and medical outreach. And as I mentioned, he is the one who authored that hymnal. Now, his wife was a classical singer, trained singer, and when S.T. Kimbrough was able to examine the hymnal, he said it had many pieces by the contemporary hymn writer Ivan Stepanovich Prochanov, leader of Russian evangelicals. So S.T. has argued that, quote, no other Methodist hymnal of the period included as much indigenous material that expanded Methodist repertory, but not beyond the known hymns of Western Protestantism, close quote. Some of the hymns were translations of hymns from the Cokesbury Hymnal, which was the popular hymnal of the ME Church South, and others were original pieces and some classic Russian hymns. Now, another thing that Yasenitsky did is he was involved in Bible teaching and writing. Because he was from a Moravian background, he started right away as a Bible teacher. And after the missionaries left in 1927, he prayed on his knees for God's guidance. His Bible was open to the story of Gideon, and he decided to launch an evangelical publication called The Sword of Gideon. And this little periodical was distributed throughout the Soviet Union, throughout the evangelical churches in the Soviet Union. There's an interesting story of how the Southern Baptists have captured this periodical from Yasenitsky, and we need to get it back. Let's just say that there's only one extant copy that I have that's not in the Southern, that was not borrowed, so-called, by a Southern Baptist scholar right before I met Gregory Yasenitsky. Now, another thing I want to say that about Yasenitsky, he was a distributor for the National Bible Society of Scotland. This allowed him to travel widely. Again, music was a connection. The head of the Scottish Bible Society who traveled there was also a classical singer, and he and Yasenitsky's wife sang duets. So there's a whole sub-theme of the importance, the centrality of music to this whole story. Now, eventually, okay, here's a picture of me and Gregory Yasenitsky when I was able to interview him in the late 1970s. Finally, in 1940, he and his family were able to emigrate to San Francisco. And here you see him in his older years, where he devoted himself to writing and paying for samizdat to educate the evangelicals in the Soviet Union, because the Methodists, of course, were forcibly merged into the evangelical church in the Soviet Union. He did this as both a Methodist and an evangelical, and he continually appealed to the General Board of Discipleship for assistance in this work, in reaching what he said were the Methodists in Russia. And at any rate, here's a photo of him not long before his death and some of the books that he wrote. Now let me move to another of the pastors. This Gurov was the second deacon ordained by Bishop Boaz. He too was a white army officer before joining the mission. Ethnically, he was a Cossack and had attended the Russian Military Academy. He served as pastor of the Methodist Church in Sitsahar, a town on the western end of the Chinese Eastern Railway. Now, his congregation was full of, it was in the context of the Bolshevik sympathizers. So there are all kinds of stories about Gurov and the conversion of Bolsheviks, one of whom then goes back into the Soviet Union as an evangelist for the Methodists. It is some very moving stories of people who probably ended up being liquidated in the Soviet Union. Gurov himself was eventually able to immigrate to the United States in the 1940s. In 1949, he became pastor of the Slavic Pentecostal Church in New York City that had been founded by the famous Cossack American evangelist Ivan Voronev. And then he eventually then returns to San Francisco and was a pastor back in San Francisco. So you see, he was working then in ethnic Russian language churches, but of Cossack origin in the United States. Here we have Basil Osipoff, who probably had the best life of any of these because he was taken as a fairly young man back to the United States by Veda Irwin and enrolled at Asbury College in Wilmore, Kentucky. Eventually, he received higher degrees. He was paid for by the mission. He was ordained as a pastor and became a professor at Asbury College. Once again, his wife was a musician, and she taught music, and he played the violin at Asbury. So he was a kind of holiness professor at Asbury College until he died in 1974. I don't have time to go into too much more about the men because I need to move toward my summary remarks. But I do want to say a bit about Konstantin Igorov. Here he is in his wedding photo. And this is from a photo album of the pictures of this church and the mission of the Igorovs, who remained long after the missionaries left and wrote plaintively of their faithfulness to Methodism and to the gospel, all alone, left behind as the last Methodist minister in Harbin. Now, here they are building their little church. Here's a picture of them celebrating Mother's Day. And they also consecrated evangelists who went back into the Soviet Union. Here's one of their evangelists preaching to Chinese in Harbin. And here's a picture of this evangelist in a drosky or going back to the Soviet Union. Here's the Epworth League of the Igorov's church, including two who became preachers and who were brought to the United States by the Irwins. And then one of these women became a missionary in Czechoslovakia, and the boy here was a boy preacher. Ultimately, the reason the Igorovs were stuck was in Harbin is because he went blind from glaucoma. And nobody would accept blind immigrants. So it took decades for the starving Igorov family to leave leave Harbin. Ultimately, they were repatriated to a relief facility through the assistance of Methodist Committee on Relief in the 1950s. Other workers, these other workers, okay, that was Igorov, there's Gavrilovchuk, Osipoff. I don't really have time now. I'm going to skip over what I was able to find out about these other pastors. But it's interesting that the whole group, in effect, are Russian-speaking but multi-ethnic. So you've got a Cossack, a Ukrainian, a Pole, a Moravian, and some Russians. You've got white army officers. Some of their converts are from the Bolshevik persuasion. So it was a very interesting group. Now let me move on to my concluding remarks. A review of the pastoral leadership for Russian Methodists in Harbin, Manchuria, raises important questions for Russian Methodist identity. The Russian language and culture and a common experience of exile were common markers for Methodist identity of these folks during the 1920s and 1930s. Yet closer examination shows that they were multicultural, including Russian, Finnish, Cossack, Ukrainian, and mixed German and Polish background. Many of their parishioners were of mixed Russian and Chinese heritage. In fact, the Igorov's church was full of mixed race people who had Russian mothers and Chinese fathers. There were not enough Russian men, because remember, this is the era of the Russian Revolution and the liquidation and fighting and killing of Russian men. So the women, Russian women stranded in Harbin, intermarried Chinese men. So this, you can speculate that the evangelical gospel of equality and American-style revivalism may have appealed to refugees. It acted as an equalizer that knitted together people from different ethnic backgrounds, but who shared a common experience of diasporic exile. And Russian culture and language glued it together to a certain extent. But this movement was an alternative to the upper class replication of Russian orthodoxy. It flourished on the margins of empire among the varied peoples of what had been the Greater Russia. Other common themes was that of self-reliance and self-discipline, honed from the experience of these leaders as army officers. Military service provided a background in leadership training for most of these Methodist pastors. They were also literate because they were officers. So you're looking at a literate leadership class that was no doubt attracted to the Bible, the centrality of the Bible, the hymnody, and the like. Another theme is work among children and youth, including orphans. Much more could be said about this if I had had time to look at some of the women who worked in this mission. They also were able to create converts who then themselves became evangelists. So this was a self-sustaining second generation movement. Now, as the information on these pastors shows, a few years in the life of the formal mission turned into lifetime commitment and transformation for these pastors. And I could say as a historian that the short-sighted conclusion of church authorities to terminate the mission because it had no future due to immigration was wrong-headed. Although the remaining Russian Methodist churches in Harbin were in fact destroyed by war and persecution, the gospel spirit of the pastors never died. Most of them maintained their ministries through self-support and strategic alliances with like-minded Protestants. Some ultimately served among other communions, notably as Pentecostals or Lutherans or independent churches. But their conversion and formation as Methodists undergirded their ministries and future contributions to Protestantism in Northeast Asia and the Soviet Union. So this mission had a huge ripple effect. At least three of them, Gregory Yasenitsky, Basil Osipoff, and Konstantin Igorov, lived and died as Methodist ministers. Others, like the Gavrilovchuks, held on as long as they could, but after decades of faithful service, became joined with the Lutherans, and the rest, I don't know which denominations they ended up. Poissy, as I've mentioned, has become seen as a founder of Pentecostalism in Finland. The power of the gospel message, including personal conversion and self-improvement through education and spiritual discipline, outreach to the poor and needy, were linchpins of the Southern Methodist message. The mission was self-conscious of being caught between, quote, godless Bolshevism on the one hand and the statist power of orthodoxy on the other. Russian pastors were drawn to the mission by possibilities of a personal relationship with God, biblical literacy, and music in their spoken language, redemption from the sin and violence of their earlier lives, and empowerment for self-improvement and service, what Wesleyans call holiness. As they worked alongside Chinese and Korean branches of the mission and in good relationship with other evangelical Protestants, they experienced the power of the gospel to overcome ethnic and political differences. Even though they have been forgotten by history, they remained faithful to Jesus Christ that they came to know through the short-lived Siberia-Manchuria mission of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And here I have, that was printed in their bulletin, the saying of John Wesley, "The best of all, God is with us." So let me conclude and stop sharing this and just say that I have a few questions that I think come from this research. How do we define our denominational identity as Methodists in a migrant situation? Was Methodism a movement or a church or something that used both of these structures in order to help people and give them a reason to live and even save their lives in situations of war and violence? How do we define the Methodist DNA? Clearly, these pastors' lives were transformed by Methodism, even if they did not remain as Methodists. So the issues of migration and Methodism, the meaning of borders and boundaries, the meaning of multiculturalism and marginality, mission from the margins, all come together in this case study of Methodist pastors in Harbin, Manchuria. Thank you.
Dana, thank you very much indeed. That was a stunningly stimulating talk, and I think it's going to stimulate all sorts of questions. I would like to pick the first one, even though I know David Bevington is champing at the bit. I'd like to ask you a very practical question, which is to do with languages, because they were clearly negotiating English, Russian, I assume Chinese languages, possibly also Japanese. How did they manage this?
They held separate annual conferences. So there were missionaries from Korea who had come to Vladivostok, who then went to Harbin. So what it was one mission. It was seen as the Manchuria-Siberia mission with 3 linguistic sections. Each of those sections had an annual conference: Russian, Chinese, and Korean. Now they related to each other as best as they could. And as we've seen, as time went on, some of these Russian language folks were actually of Chinese ethnicity. When you see mixed race children, the second generation.
Yeah.
So I would have to be able, I need to say that we need Russian speakers to go back and to mine these journals to see how they related to each other. My research, my Russian long ago, it disappeared. I can still read a bit, but it's not, I decided to base this paper on the extensive correspondence and interviews material that I have that no one has. And I'll have to leave it to future scholars whose Russian is better to actually reread these journals. And especially, I think this thing like the Sword of Gideon, which is a Methodist evangelistic contribution to all of Russian Protestantism, to be able to fully answer the question you've asked.
And indeed, the Sword of Gideon, I noticed, had a bilingual title. So they clearly had some publications which had bilingualism or bilingual titles at least.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Let me turn to David Bebbington. David.
Thank you so much. Can I ask whether the Orthodox Church was uniformly hostile?
Well, that's a great question. What Gregory Yasinitsky told me is that they did intersect. They had moments of intersection with Orthodox priests. That and the music ministry of the Methodists, which their choir was a public choir full of top musicians who had fled Russia, most of whom were Orthodox. So you could say at the lay level, there was a lot of intersection. At a formal theological level, there were specific events where they might collaborate with the Orthodox. Yasinitsky mentioned that members from his unit who were massacred by the Bolsheviks, some were buried through the Orthodox cathedral, the Orthodox church there in Harbin, and he went to that service. So as is the case in real life, I would say, there's a lot of movement by laity and probably a few sort of friendly, formal events between priests and ministers. Beyond that, I don't know.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, while we're thinking about this, can I just ask if there are any questions in the room, Jordan?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. As a Methodist who was ordained in Russia, I found your presentation fascinating. Particular question about the Methodist Episcopal Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church North, to distinguish it from the South, was also working in Korea and China as well. In the 1920s, the two mission societies joined to have a unified mission. How are they present also working in Harbin, Manchuria, in the region, or not? And then also with the pastors, are these pastors becoming Methodist in exile, or were they Methodists in European Russia before coming to Siberia and then into China?
As far as I know, this was a mission strictly of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, whereas the Methodist Episcopal Church North was in the Finnish and Russian area. And when this mission was forcibly closed in 1927, ostensibly for lack of funds, there was huge cultural ignorance by the American bishops. And they transferred some of the women missionaries were transferred to work with Belarusians in Europe under the ignorant statement that white Russians in Harbin and white Russians in Eastern Europe are the same. Now, Belarusians are not political white Russians, two completely different groups. So the reasons for shutting down the mission were, well, anyway, I won't go into what I think about that, but though I've already told you. So Poisty, though, was a convert then of the Methodist Episcopal Church North, who then travels to Harbin because clearly he didn't want to stay in the Soviet Union, right? So he ends up in China, and he's listed as a, quote, fraternal worker, something between a missionary and a native pastor. But he's always posed with the missionaries in the photos. So he's a fraternal worker, presumably from the Methodist Episcopal Church North, who's then gone to work with under the Southern Mission in China, in Harbin. So I do not believe there were Methodist Episcopal Church North missionaries in Harbin. That was considered the field of the Southern Church. Not sure if I remembered their second question, but I've covered most of it.
Dana, can I have another go at a question on following on from David's point? You made a comment, I think, that Methodism appealed to white Russian officers, and I was kind of confused by that, because I could see that hymnody, I can see that the shared emigrant experience, I could see that a sort of dispossession experience drew people to Methodism, but white Russian officers, I would have thought, would be more likely to cleave to orthodoxy. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about the attractions of Methodism for white Russians.
Firstly, many of the refugees in Harbin were anti-Bolshevik. You know, they were fleeing from the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
So there were lots of white Russians, especially of the middle classes and people who were in the arts. They had the institute that the Methodists ran in Harbin employed Russian academics to teach things like Russian literature. So the first thing you've got is a general exodus of educated Russians who were being purged in the Soviet Union, who tended toward the, quote, white Russian cause, or maybe were monarchists, who knows. They were not happy with the Bolsheviks. So that's the class, one of the groups that then went to Harbin. The officers, what I think is striking is how many of the pastors of the Methodist mission are officers. So the officer training, something about it. I mean, we've seen this theme throughout mission history, Martin of Tours on down. The officers had that sense of discipline. And think about what Methodist is. It's an itinerancy. You go where we send you. And we have bishops. They were immediately promoted and ordained. So as soon as they got some training, they were ordained. This means they could hold leadership positions, entrepreneurial leadership in a military-like structure by becoming Methodists. They could not have done this as Orthodox. Orthodox priest training was a completely different animal. And so these were kind of the, what you call bourgeois class, right?
Right.
Who are attracted to the egalitarian literist tradition of Methodism.
Fascinating. That's thank you very much. Clive.
Thank you, Don. You described a society that's very fragmented and almost chaotic, a frontier society with a lot of refugees. I wondered, in that situation, how much of a kind of regular Methodist polity did they introduce? Did they have what kind of structure? Did they have a class system? I saw they held a love feast at least once. So what was the kind of institutions that they tried to build?
Yes, you see evidence of the whole range of Methodist institutions in that mission. They had a women's group, that they had an Epworth League. They had love feasts. They studied Methodist polity and doctrine in the Biblical Institute. They held revivals. And of course, this is the Southern Methodist Church. They met in annual conference and quarterly conference. That you can see all of that laid out in these periodicals. They would publish they waited for the bishop to ordain people. You know, the bishop would travel through once a year or something, and they would hold the annual conference. So they were actually, it's very interesting that the Methodist structure made a lot of sense in that setting, both in terms of having a bishop who was not right there, right, but who came through ever so often, and then relative egalitarianism between the missionaries and the pastors. They were very close to each other, and that in a sense also helped make the structure work.
Thank you. Any other last questions in the room before we conclude?
ask one question, Dana? There are Methodist churches in Russia today and a few other Wesleyan churches as well. Do you know of any sort of line of continuity from Harbin to any of the present Methodist churches within Russia?
When, okay, I want to let me say more about that hymnal. I got an unmarked brown paper bag in the mail from California that contained the hymnal from Gregory Yasinitsky. At that time, it was the only one known. Now, S.T. Kimbrough was able to track down several more once he started working on this, once he found out about this, since he works on hymnody and multicultural music and such. But when the hymnal was taken by hand by Bob Harmon back to Ekaterinburg, where the committee of the new Russian Methodist Church was meeting to form its own music, they had never heard that there were any Methodists in Harbin. No one knew about this. Now, why is this important? For one thing, the history of this mission gives another reason that can be used to argue for the continuity of Methodism from the 19 teens in Russia, starting in Vladivostok around 1920, that can justify their existence in Russia under the draconian anti-Protestant laws there. It also means that suddenly there are sources, because if you figure that a lot of those Russian sources were destroyed in Russia itself by Stalin and etc., the existence of a couple of copies of the Methodist Journal that the Irwins saved, it actually documents a theological life, an organizational life, and an identity life for Russian Methodists. And that documentation doesn't exist anywhere else. So the memory of this mission has proven to be important for the Russian Methodists now, even though they are now in Moscow and such, in a completely different part of the continent. Now, in order to try to make this literature available, my Center for Global Christianity some years ago started a scanning project where I used all my resources, such as they were, to scan the Methodist Christian Advocate, the scrapbook, and the Methodist, the journal, The Methodist. And those were then put online and made available to the seminarians in Moscow so that they could start writing papers and doing things, having a kind of history of Methodists. Since those journals documented that they had articles about Methodism in other parts of the continent, they're a valuable source. Now, the Sword of Gideon, I really would like somebody to retrieve that. What happened now, and Gregory Yasinitsky said, this is a uniquely Methodist contribution to Russian evangelicalism. You know, he always saw what he was doing was as a Methodist. But of course, a Southern Baptist professor came to him and got there like a month before I did and took all the copies of the Sword of Gideon except one and took it to Southern Seminary to scan or to film. No, actually, that man was supposed to send them back to Gregory Yasinitsky, and he never did. So buried, there are microfilms of this in a Southern Baptist archive. And Methodists need to go look at that, retrieve it, put it in usable format, and that will give us another stage of history, at least of evangelism, of some of the years after the churches start to decline. So the knowledge of this among Russian Methodists now, we have made available online these journals. And if you Google Russian Methodism, Boston University, you can find the major sources. Not my correspondence, not the photographs, not the things, but the Igorov scrapbook, which was owned by the Irwins, who also just mailed it to me in an unmarked package. Thank God that the snail mail was, good enough to not lose this material. The scrapbook, the Methodist Christian Advocate, and the Methodist are online if you will Google Russian Methodism, Boston University.
Dana,
Thanks,
thank
Dana.
you so much.
And I spent a few months as a volunteer missionary in Vyazma, Russia, working with the Church of the Nazarene. And I have a hymnal that the Church of the Nazarene produced in Russia. So if anyone wants to do work on comparative hymnals, there's another source. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And thank you, Dana, very much indeed. A barnstorming finish to our seminar, and a wonderful account of what Peter Laslett would call a world we have lost, really. So thank you very much for recovering it for us.